Hi, everyone. I'm Peter Huang, the director of the Division of Rhinology, and it's my pleasure to speak tonight. My talk is called From Consultancies to Startups, Adventures in Medical Entrepreneurship. So these are my disclosures, and this talk was reviewed by the CME office, and unfortunately, we can't offer you CME tonight because of this. Part of this talk is about talking about startups, one of them which is mine, and that disqualifies us for CME, even though there's no actual commercial product available. So apologies to all who came for CME credit, hopefully next week. So what's the genesis of this talk? Well, certainly research is the cornerstone of innovation, and that's where a lot of the IP from this department comes from. And of course, we're constantly trying to innovate our clinical practices, so that's another source of innovation. And certainly at Stanford, we have an environment where innovation is in the DNA of this department. But in general, I don't think that physicians are naturally entrepreneurial or business-minded. And so I think as I've sort of canvassed different members of our community, it seemed that there's wide interest, but not a lot of exposure to developing business acumen and entrepreneurial skills among residents and early career physicians. So I thought, well, I'm sort of a journeyman entrepreneur. I'm certainly not an expert, but I could share the different forms of medical entrepreneurship that I've been involved with in my career. And then in particular, if I could give myself advice, rewinding 20 years ago, what would I want to share with somebody who is in that position now? And what lessons could I offer? So that's the goal for me tonight, to share just my experiences. And there's plenty of people in this audience I know who have greater education and more experience than I do. So I certainly welcome you to chime in and share your experiences as well. So just a little bit about me. I've been in academic practice my whole career, practicing solely rhinology and endoscopic skull-base surgery. And the things that I've done in an entrepreneurial vein have varied from medical legal consulting to large corporate consulting. And then sometimes there are short-term consulting opportunities, like this company that was developing a nasal COVID treatment that I provided some technical consulting on. I've done a fair bit of consulting for startups, including those that have failed, those that are in progress, and those that have succeeded. And in general, over my career, I've moved more towards early stage startup consulting. I think that's, for me, more interesting, and where I think I can provide more input and have more influence. So that's in general the trend for my consulting activities. And then I had the opportunity recently to be a co-founder of a startup. So we're going to go with 10 steps to prepare for medical entrepreneurship. And number one is to know your worth. I think that we all know our value, or we have a pretty good idea of our value in the medical community. But what about when you step outside as a physician with a lot of expertise? What is your value to the projects that you work on, or to the interactions that you have with people outside of medicine? And I think that as physicians, we underestimate our value. So, we are incredibly educated, specialized or subspecialized. Many of us are extensively published. We're opinion leaders. And also, in general, we're used to drawing higher incomes. And so if we invest our time in something, that's already a higher opportunity cost. So we really need to make it worth our time if we're going to take on some kind of consulting opportunity or other entrepreneurial opportunity. Of course, early in your career, you can't expect to rake in a lot of money. So you need to start with charging less, just like any other profession where you're starting out. But sometimes you just want to get your foot in the door, have a little bit of experience, and that's worth the price of admission rather than the actual monetary gain from that experience. Experience does count. So when you're trying to figure out what your worth is, keep in mind that especially when you're working with large companies, there is a sliding scale for your hourly contributions or your hourly rates, but they don't necessarily tell you that. I've learned that lesson. So you could be hovering at a certain level, thinking that you're topping out because you're very experienced or you're very senior, and you don't really realize that the person next to you at the same conference room is getting paid a lot more. And so this is something that I think, when you become aware of it, you become less hesitant to ask questions about the scale and having your CV reviewed and things like that. For startups, they tend to be more cash limited situations. So founders are going to be more interested in offering you equity. You want to start to understand what the tax consequences of options are, the economics of exercising options or holding options. And if you believe in a company, options can be great. But if you're not sure, you could spend a lot of time on something, have a lot of options that become worthless if the company takes a dive. So that's a risk. And some people will do a mix of hourly, honorarium plus options to kind of split the difference. Don't give away your expertise for free. And I would say this is something that's really hard to do because in our academic environment, we're so used to just like teaching or sharing our knowledge. Like that's our culture. But in a business culture, it's different. And so if you start to give that away, nobody has any reason to stop you from that. And if you're having a conversation with a VC or an industry representative in the operating room, the direction that discussion may go may lead to some very valuable information that only you have because of your expertise. And once you release that to whoever, it's no longer yours. It's devalued because it's given away. So just keep that in mind. And so if you feel like there's significant effort that's going to be made, or if you have something of particular value, don't be afraid to ask for a consulting fee. I think there are some exceptions to this. If I'm meeting with a startup for the first time, I'm not going to use that opportunity to say, this is what I normally charge and blah, blah, blah. I'm going to show them through that first opportunity, that first meeting, what I can bring. This is my knowledge base. This is my experience. This is my network. And sometimes for a friend, I might do a favor. So those are some exceptions where you don't want to just immediately start charging for your expertise. And then as you become more experienced and you recognize that you now are in a key opinion leader status, try to understand what the market is for your services. Certainly my medical legal rates have gone up as I've gone up in rank. And when you're talking to a startup company, if you come in as a key opinion leader, you certainly have more negotiating strength. It's always good with the startup company to ask for the percent equity that's being offered to you. So 50,000 shares sounds awesome, but that might be 0.1% of the company versus 1% of the company. It just depends on the scale. So these might seem like awkward questions to ask, like, oh, I'm grateful, like they gave me 50,000 shares and I'm trying to figure out how much it's worth, but it's really valid to ask those questions. And if you're working closely with founders, they shouldn't hesitate to tell you how they're valuing your contribution. And as I mentioned, the rates are going to vary according to how experienced you are. And if you're not sure, ask somebody that you trust that's done this before. So I want to share a few hits and misses from my own career. So when I first got here, I was approached by a venture capital company who was looking at investing in a startup ENT company that had some navigation technology and instrument technology. And they said, hey, Dr. Huang, we really want to learn from you, and you have such a great, position in the field and blah, 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 and like buttering me up. And I thought, oh, this is really great. Like I'm going to work with this VC company, and then they're going to like ask me to be a consultant, and I'm going to have this relationship. So in this room, I met with them. They downloaded a good hour of information, like the complete landscape of modern rhinologic surgical technology, as I could do easily in an hour. And they said, great, thank you so much. And that was the last I heard from them. Gone. And I just realized, like, I was just completely taken because they made me feel really good that I was the expert and I was mixing with people of influence. And I thought that I was going to get something back in return. But there was nothing negotiated about that. And they had no obligation to me. So it was like, I was the fool. So fast forward this year, I got another request for venture capital to review a company that was developing a drug for HHT, hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia. And that's something that we had done this clinical trial on. So they emailed me. I said, yeah, great. I'm happy to share that with you. But I'd like to do it under a consultancy, and these are my rates. Within 3 hours, I got the reply, great, here's the contract. When can we set up a time? So, I had to learn that the hard way. So I hope that you'll understand those types of dynamics. And of course, you have to read the room a little bit too. So it's not to say that every time you can just do that, but that's something that really stuck with me early on. And it's like, I'm not going to fall for that again. Friend consulting is a little bit ambiguous. Certainly, like if somebody in the department asked me to consult for one of their friends, and of course, this is a very networked department, I'm going to do that. Like, I'm not going to ask for any kind of consulting, at least in the beginning, or consulting fees in the beginning. But I've also been approached by people who are primarily VCs who have an academic appointment at Stanford. So their signature block says, adjunct assistant professor of something. And they've asked me to consult for them. But I know that that person is actually 90% in the VC world and 10% in academic. So I've had those situations where I said, well, what you're asking is actually outside the realm of our academic relationship. So I would like to ask for consulting or consultancy. And, that person was really offended and they wrote a very bluntly rude email back to me to make me feel bad, but I actually didn't feel bad at all. Because I've been through that before. And I was like, I don't need to give away my expertise. And if they want to try to find somebody that knows more about my field than me, good luck, fine. I mean, that's great if they can't, but it's just not worth my time. For corporate consulting, so recently I just signed a contract with Stryker, but they valued my hourly rate before this upcoming conference at about half of what I normally charge based on large corporate consulting. So I already knew off the bat, like, this is way off. And the first meeting of this group for the consulting was in 2 days. So I said, I'm sorry, I can't accept this contract. Here's my CV, take it back, and I'd like to negotiate this. And they could not do it in time. So I did not cave. I sat out that first meeting. Of course, like, lost revenue to me, but I wasn't gonna accept a lower rate for for years to come. Like, I wasn't going to do it. So I just sat it out. They came back with a much better rate. Still not what I would normally expect, but good enough. And I signed it, and I'm officially a consultant. And then in the startup world, Aronix is the company that did the cryotherapy device. And so I was at a very early stage with them, like just the two co-founders, and I was their first medical consultant. So they gave me a nice equity offer, and I worked with them, and I wrote papers with them. I presented it at the American Rhinological Society. Everything. I mean, I knew that really, like, I had helped them get to a place where they had funding and they were imminently going to be acquired. But I also realized I had been working with them for 3 years, and there was no additional offers of equity to me. So I actually took an opportunity one time when they came over to talk, and I just said, I appreciate that I've had the opportunity to be with you all, but I need to know now what your future is in terms of my role in the company, because I have other things I can work on. And there hasn't been any additional equity offered to me. So they immediately offered me another round, which ended up being a not insubstantial sum when they finally got acquired. And had I not asked for that, I can assure you they would not have come to me and said, Dr. Wong, we owe you this because you've been working so hard and you're unappreciated. So these are just some lessons from my own, and I think I'm fairly savvy, but I've made lots of mistakes. So these are the kinds of things I'm hoping to share with you. So constantly gauge, your value. And as illustrated by some of these examples, you may really trust the people that you're working with, but it doesn't mean that they are going to volunteer to give you more just because you think they should. And the way that you negotiate can be really important. I've been part of some other failed startups as a co-founder where they just arbitrarily give you percentages, and a few percent plus or minus. Like if you're at 5% versus 8%, I mean that could actually be a lot of money if that were to be a successful company. So positioning yourself in that way and really understanding how equity is shared is really important. Okay, number 2, protect your IP. So this is just a lesson that I learned. So this is in 2000 when Medtronic invited me to go to their facility headquarters in Florida. I was 3 years out from in my career. And they just said, well, we want you to come and use our equipment and give us some feedback. So I said, okay, this is great. This is cool. I'm going to the headquarters. They're going to spend time with me and they care what I think. So I did that. And, just working in the Max sign, I said, oh, it'd be really cool to have a shaver blade that has a window. Like maybe you could rotate that so you can then shave posteriorly rather than just anteriorly. And they're like, okay. So, wrote it down. 2 years later, winner of a medical device excellent award, the rotating 360 shaft rotation blade. And I looked at them and I'm like, that was my idea. But it was theirs because when I went there, it was just in our conversation. I hadn't thought about it before then. So it wasn't like they didn't steal my idea. I gave it to them, right? And that is on those terms, I had no recourse, but I had nothing to complain about because that was the nature of that relationship, that maybe they would get some idea out of it, right? But when you look at it in retrospect, if you think about something like that ahead of time, you can there's different ways that you can protect that. And I know that Dr. Patel uses this on every case. So I don't. But had I had a little bit of royalties, I think that would have helped me make some payments on my house or something. But anyways. So protect your IP by writing everything down, keeping a log. So you often see entrepreneurs carrying around the black books and, write entries in there, sign and date things, draw pictures, write notes from your meetings. NDAs have a role, but I don't think in general we really would expect people to sign NDAs, especially if you're looking for investors in the first round. That's not really something that's typically done. But maybe if you're going a deeper dive with a company and you're going to really start to reveal some interest, some things that are really core to your company, then I think it's appropriate to sign an NDA. And as with that Medtronic experience, if you just want to let something go in the air, then it's free. So if you think that there's something that you have, you don't have to share everything when you meet with a company. You can have an idea and then go home and write it down and incubate it. And that could take years before it matures. You can protect your IP by looking into patents. And if you're working on something that comes from your academic work, of course, that is done through your academic institution. If you're not even sure about patentability, you can Google patent search. You can meet with Stanford OTL. And they're great. I had one idea. We did a clinical trial for xylitol, and I said, "Oh, has anybody patented xylitol for nasal?" And I shared it with them, and they did a whole search. I mean, they did thousands of dollars of work that I didn't want to pay for myself, and it came out of the work that we're doing here. So it was a really good experience. Of course, you might have an idea that's generated outside of your academic work, in which case you need to be prepared to pay for the patents. For the private route, you need to understand patent heights, be willing to foot the bill for that. It does create value for your startup, of course, if you have more patents. And then one thing that's really important is you need to really delineate your entrepreneurial work that originates from your academic work and your entrepreneurial work that's outside of that. So most of the time, if I'm doing something that's my own project, it's going to be outside. So I won't run any clinical trials here. I won't talk to patients about it. I use a Gmail account, everything meeting offsite. I mean, that's the way that you keep it separate, because if it becomes valuable, you can bet that Stanford is going to come back and look for the use of resources for the success of your startup or whatever it is. And I mean, there's nothing to hide, but it's just good bookkeeping, right? To just kind of be accountable for that. So there's just one example of, like, how do you start small? So this is actually a startup company that makes these sheaths that are to protect the nasal airway in skull-based surgery. And it's a nice thing. We're using them fairly often here at Stanford, and it really protects the nasal cavity. And this was Karam Asmara was the neurosurgical skull-based fellow last year. And he said, hey, having a complete circle in the back, like in the area we're working, doesn't make sense. Let's cut out half of it so we can have an open central area, so that the scopes and instruments don't bump into each other. And so for those of you who haven't really seen how this works, this is the transsphenoidal approach. He's cutting that little piece off, and you can see that this is getting put into the nasal cavity to protect the nasal airway. And then this modification that he did on both sides, it then makes like a perfect circle without something in the middle. So, we said, hey, this is great, Karam, like, we're going to use this, and we do it every time now. And he just cuts it out. And I told him, I said, well, Karam, like, maybe this is something that the company's interested in. Do you want to look into that? And he was interested in, kind of entrepreneurial ideas. And so I kind of mentored him just through this really small thing. But I told him, I said, you need to draw it out, sign and date it. And then we talked a little bit about, what do you want to get out of this? Like, what would be a successful negotiation if they thought that this was a good idea? And I just told them, I said, for you, what's probably most valuable is just the experience, the chance to present something, to develop some IP, maybe get a little bit of royalties out of it. It's more about connecting and learning. So he met with the CEO and actually was very successful. He was brought on as a consultant. I don't know what royalties he's getting from it, but it can't be that much. And he's part of their team now, right? And there's a lot to be learned from that. So he's like fresh out of fellowship, already has a nice consultancy. So that's an example of leveraging something that's pretty small, but actually, like, what do you do with that? Well, here's a very practical way that he converted an idea into something that has some entrepreneurial value. So early on, just accept small opportunities to make the most of those. Those are great opportunities to just understand the dynamics of working with industry. And it is kind of like an audition, really, when you're giving these opportunities. You want to show that you're likable, that you're great to work with, that you'd be a valued member of the team, that you know a lot. And this may be leveraging any number of skills: clinical expertise, clinical research, basic or translational. For me, I did a lot of my early research in biomaterials and biocompatibility of biomaterials. And I paid for a lot of that on my own, just with my own startup money, without depending on the surgical instrument companies or the technology companies. But I developed a model for looking at this in a rabbit. And so any biomaterial that needed validation in that model, they knew that they saw my paper and then they came to me. So, and I was interested in biomaterials. So when I came here, it was a very natural segue into consulting for these companies, because that became a very hot area in rhinology. So as you then collect more opportunities, for each one, you want to ask yourself, well, what am I getting out of this? And sometimes it's the financial compensation, but as you can also see, sometimes it's just networking, or just like, I want to learn about a different pathway, regulatory pathway, some other thing that's going to add to your knowledge base. So you want to factor all that in when you're evaluating opportunities. And eventually you will become the content expert. And I would say it's not fair, but the rich get richer. So as you get more experience, you're going to be sought after more. And these things in the consultancy framework are certainly valuable for gaining more consultants. But then if you eventually have your own startup, you also are going to call on that same network. And I've done that, like with my startup. Like I know these people in these other areas that I've worked with in industry, and it's been very valuable. So number 4, maintain your integrity and ethics. You've probably seen this cover or some form of it in a lot of places. But entrepreneurship and academics are not mutually exclusive. There is really a fine balance, though, in terms of, what is required of you in your consultancy or your startup, and preserving your personal and academic integrity. And that comes up a lot, especially if you collect conflicts of interest like I have, and you're asked in a public forum to comment on something. You really need to be completely transparent. And when you're working with other companies, draw some boundaries. I mean, I consult on 3 or 4 companies that are strictly drug delivery in the nose, but it may sound like they're all conflicted, but I'm very careful to say, I'm going to work on this. And if it's something that is now overlapping with a different company, I'm going to recuse myself from that part of my consulting. And they appreciate that, but they still invite me to join. The Wall Street Journal litmus test is, what if somebody wrote about your relationship the next day on the cover of the Wall Street Journal? Are you okay with it? How does it show up? And when I'm consulting, I think what I like to be known for, and I think what I am known for, is just being really objective and calling out stuff that doesn't make sense. You might be tempted to just say, rah, rah, like you're doing great. And I'm here to like cheer you on and make your company more successful by like being visible and cheering you on. But actually, that's not really what most startups are looking for. They want a really clear eye. They want to hear the weaknesses. They want to hear the negatives, and that helps them be better. And so your willingness to be objective and to call that out actually adds value to your consultancy. So my cautionary tale here, Ubiome, which was the 23andMe of poop. Why are they calling me? Well, I'll tell you the story. So this was had a lot of credibility, UCSF incubated startup, Y Combinator, and OS funded venture. They emailed me in 2018, Dear Peter, we want you to be involved with strategy and advising for upper respiratory microbiome, which really at that point was becoming very hot. And they wrote about this, what we want you to do. And it was kind of weird, this part here about, we want you to like relate to this network of physicians who prescribe our tests for patients who don't have a PCP. I thought, that's a little strange. They assumed that I was going to sign on the next day, so they sent me the contract. I wasn't going to sign it. I needed to understand what was going on. So I set up some more phone calls with them. I just didn't really understand exactly what they were trying to develop in the upper respiratory area. So I let it hang for a while. And finally, I just said, I just don't really get what the plan is here. So I just bowed out. I need to decline your offer. So that was February 2019. 2 months later, the FBI raids Ubiome's office. Scrutiny for billing practices. And they had already set up this billing practice for GI. And here, CNBC. So basically what they figured out was that the company was billing the insurers multiple times off the same specimen in different waves without notifying the insurers. So this eventually made it to the Department of Justice. And you can see this whole concept of this that didn't really make sense to me, this captive network of doctors and healthcare providers. They were fraudulently given misleading information, and the company was using the identity of doctors without their knowledge or authorization. So this actually hasn't been settled yet. I tried to figure out what was going on with them. I think the founders were like refugee or like not refugees. They're fugitives, like somewhere in Europe and not found. But this is just a couple of months after I signed off and said, I don't really want to be part of it. So, these kinds of things, like, I mean, this could happen to anybody. I could have just said yes, because like, that's cool. Microbiome is a hot area and, this is an emerging company. So fortunately, there was just something about it for me. I just was able to sniff out that just didn't seem right. And I thought this was a really, a nice summary statement from the Department of Justice. This indicates that healthcare does not lend itself to a quote unquote move fast and break things approach, but rather to approach of compliance and accountability. That's just a really good reminder. Like, things can seem really hot, but we just have to really have that clear eye and really evaluate everything for what it really is. Number 5, learn design thinking. This is not something I need to spend a lot of time here because so many people are involved in the biodesign process. But just to say that, it's a great resource. Certainly, our department has been heavily influenced by biodesign, whether it's people in our department being educated in the biodesign program or whether it's our participation with the biodesign teams. There's a textbook on it, and this flow diagram is very familiar to anybody who's done any work in biodesign. And companies have been launched. So this was born out of Stanford Biodesign a few years ago. I consulted with them early on, but then I finally had to bow out because they were starting to conflict with another company that I had been working with. So I just told them I can't consult with them anymore. But this was developed from Classic Design Thinking. This is a company that was trying to improve drug delivery in the nose by modifying the device to improve the target of topical nasal steroids. Number 6, collaborate. So for sure, along in the same vein as the whole biodesign philosophy, you don't have, it's very unlikely that you have all the skills to be successful in this business. And you need a network and you need people that complement your skills. So the classic biodesign team is somebody with clinical expertise, somebody with technical engineering expertise, and somebody with business expertise. And when you look at the people that you're working with, you do want to make sure that you complement each other well. And certainly, I think investors are looking at the team as well as the technology. Is it a complete team? How does the team get along? How do they present themselves? Are there any holes in expertise? Number 7, educate yourself. If you want to go into to this type of work, you need to up your game. We spend so much time learning all medical lingo, but there's certainly a lot of lingo in entrepreneurial and business activities that you want to be very comfortable with. And fortunately, there's a lot of resources available online. And during the pandemic, I started diving into these because everybody was doing webinars, and these are some of the ones that I participated in, and they're great. So NASDAQ has a really great resource to their entrepreneurial center, and it's all free. And if any of you are interested in any of these, I can share with you links for these. There's a lot of other online resources for startups. And at Stanford, I did this program, the Ignite program, which is a certificate program from the Graduate School of Business. So I decided to go that way instead of biodesign education. After talking to some mentors, I opted for this certificate program, which was great. And if anybody's interested in that program, I'm happy to share that with you if you don't have time to get an MBA. Number 8, expect an uphill climb. So 90% of startups fail. 75% of venture-backed startups fail. And it's a hard road. So, we hear all about all the success stories, but there's a lot of carnage along the way. So you have to be prepared for that. And you have to be prepared to invest a lot, not only money, but time. And you're really going to build equity through sweat equity. So, if a venture capital firm invests in you, they're looking for a 10x return. So that's just the start of the game, right? You have to deliver on that, and that's a lot of pressure. So up until you get to that point, there's other things that you can do to maintain your viability, like being really lean with your research. So how do you run an efficient group? Do a lot of work yourself. It's fun, but it takes time, and make sure that your loved ones are on board. So number 10, seek advisors. And so here's some people that Dr. Capasso. So I surveyed some people just who I knew that had some activities and interest in entrepreneurship. So Dr. Capasso here, his words: yes, it's sexy to say you are an entrepreneur, but understand which role you want to play and when. Very difficult to be a CEO with a busy clinical practice and to have work-life balance if you have family. You can still be very useful and have a lot of fun as an advisor or board member. Your co-founders are almost as important as your significant other. Choose wisely. And wise words. Dr. Santa Maria: takes a long time to develop devices and therapeutics. Overnight success in medicine means 10 to 20 years. And it's a fine line between knowing when to push through all the people saying no and when you should stop and listen to them. Learn to pivot at the right time. And don't do it alone. Here you're hearing this again. Don't do it alone. It's a lot of work. It's better to build a team. Doyan Cho, former resident who's now at the University of Alabama, and he has some patents for nanoparticle drug delivery. So his thoughts: you can't sell an idea. You have to have a specific real product that has cleared preclinical testing or phase 1 clinical trials. And for this type of technology, a reimbursement pathway is critical to success, which I certainly agree with. Learn how to pitch in 5 minutes. It's very different from presenting in academics. Recognize when you lost momentum and have a plan B, and it's a full-time job. And then Dr. Seth from UCSF, be wary of investing companies. When he was a resident, he invented this laser otoscope for detecting effusions and was very excited to license that to Welch Allyn. And they acquired it to kill it. So they acquired it and they shelved it so that they could file an identical patent. And he told me that it took a long time legally to try to reclaim that IP. And I think these are wise words too. You may think you have a great idea, and you might, but it probably won't be until your third invention or idea that you actually have some success. So don't be discouraged if an idea is not working out. There will be more. So now, share with a little bit about my how I put it together for this startup that I'm involved with. When I was a resident, there was some very vague but anecdotal data coming out of Sweden, out of the Karolinska, that was talking about using humming for patients with sinusitis. And even though I was in California doing my residency in San Francisco, it still seemed very goofy to be humming for your sinuses. But it kind of locked in, like, I wonder why that is. And, these are not dummy people at Karolinska. So maybe there's something to it, but I don't have time to deal with this right now. And this is this whole idea about incubating for years. So I just kind of parked it away. Bryant Lin on the left, he's an internal medicine faculty here. He was involved with Aranex, the company, the cryotherapy company. He was one of the early biodesign grads, I think like 17 or 18 years ago. And he's a really great resource on campus for startup activity. He's very knowledgeable. So I would meet with him quarterly. We would just start talking about different ideas, like all kinds of things, and we talked about vibration way back when, but we never got around to it. But then the guy on the right, Parmesh Gopi, was one of my patients, and he was an ex-CEO. He had just finished his term as a CEO and was kind of in between. He saw me for sinusitis, but didn't really have sinusitis. I said, well, Parmesh, I have nothing to offer you because you already tried all the medications. You don't need surgery. It's like, no, I must have something, and I want something holistic. So I said, okay, humming. Why don't you try humming? And he was fascinated. He comes from an Indian background. He does chanting, and he's kind of into it. And so he said, okay, and let's meet up after and talk about this more. And so he has an engineering background. So we kind of all got together, and we have this company called Sound Health. And this was a prototype. So talking about making your dollars count. This was developed by Paramesh's nephew, who was a product design major at UC Davis. And we used aftershocks transducers, which are the bone conducting headphones, right? And we put them on there, and we created this prototype device, and we ran a clinical trial. Now we have a more commercial device, which is basically the basis of this is treating nasal congestion with a resonant frequency that is based on the volume of your sinuses. So that's kind of our technology. So we're using a smartphone face scan and then collecting points. This approximates, so we've tried to, using an AI database to calculate the volume of your sinuses based on your surface landmarks. And then a resonant frequency tone, and then you wear that for anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes. And this was our first trial, and I was shockingly, it actually helped. Who knew? But there is a validated symptom score called the total nasal symptom score. And after 10 minutes, you could see that 66% of people exceeded the minimum clinically important difference. And then after 20 minutes, 90% did. So, our pitch here is that this is a non-pharmacologic approach for nasal congestion. So not only allergic rhinitis, but maybe patients who are pregnant, maybe sinus patients too. And interestingly, secondarily, we were actually just trying to look for adverse effects. So we said, I hope it doesn't make anybody worse. Like look for headache and facial pain, but patients who had that pre-existing actually improved as well. And so when we start to look at the mechanism, we actually think that the vibration regulates the autonomic inputs around the sphenopalatine ganglion, and that might be why you get some autonomic calibration of parasympathetic versus sympathetic in the nose, and we have some images of like the turbinates decongesting, and maybe that's also how it helps with headache, similar to the autonomic imbalances related to migraine. So those are some of the directions that we think we might go with this. And it for me, it was sort of an encapsulation of all the different skills that I had acquired over time. So like going to the cadaver lab and studying resonance in a cadaver, developing prototypes, publishing clinical trials. Then we pitched, and we got a lot of no's. But we refined that pitch. So at this point, we have seed funding, and we've had a initial call with the FDA, and we have an RCT underway that'll hopefully be our pivotal trial, and hopefully start selling product next year. So some of the stuff I've done before, and a lot of it's still new for me. So like for me, this is just really fun and fresh because I'm still learning. I have a lot to learn, and I've learned a lot from my co-founders who have done this before or had more experience. And so I'm along for the ride, and it's really been a fun addition to what I do professionally. So this is a common funding cycle diagram in terms of how startups get funded and how they get released ultimately to IPO and beyond. And even though it seems like we've already worked hard on this and done a lot for a couple years, we're way down here still. We are not out of the valley of death yet. So it remains to be seen. Which way are we going to go? Is it going to be a huge success, or is it just going to go to the graveyard like all those other ones that I consulted for? Stay tuned. So, for me, it's been really fun to have these side gigs, but I'm definitely not leaving my day job. Yeah. That's it. Thank you very much.